The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to the NOAA Center for Weather and Climate Prediction here in College Park, Maryland. Thank you to both the reporters in the room and those joining us virtually for today's announcement of the 2023 hurricane season outlook. My name is Allison Santorelli and I am the media contact for today's event. At the conclusion of this news conference, you may reach me at nws.pa at noaa.gov. The news release and graphics related to today's announcement will be available on noaa.gov shortly. For those of you joining us by webinar, this news conference is being recorded. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please disconnect at this time. And with that, I'd like to introduce our host for today, Dr. Mike Farah, Director of NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Prediction.
Thank you, Allison. Welcome to, I'm really honored to be the host for today's ceremony, an event, and welcome you here to this world-class facility here in College Park, Maryland. Scientists at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Prediction are dedicated to delivering national and global weather, water, and climate information to protect life and property, as well as the economic well-being of the nation. The building you're in today is home to 5 of our 9 national centers, including first, NCEP Central Operations, or NCO, who operate the weather and climate operational supercomputing system our models run on, as well as other processing and dissemination systems. Secondly, the Environmental Modeling Center, or EMC, where the computer modelers develop and improve our nation's weather models. Third, the Weather Prediction Center, or WPC, where national forecasters provide services 24/7 for weather forecasts to support our National Weather Service's 122 local weather forecast offices. Fourth, the Ocean Prediction Center, where forecasters provide ocean predictions to support safe maritime activities and commerce. And finally, fifth, the Climate Prediction Center, or CPC, where forecasters develop seasonal temperature and precipitation outlooks, outlooks and forecasts for El Nino and La Nina, and the Atlantic hurricane season outlook, which is what we're here to talk about today. In addition to the 5 centers here in this building, we have 4 other operational centers located across the country, including the Aviation Center in Kansas City, the Storm Prediction Center for tornadoes in Norman, Oklahoma, and the Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado. But perhaps the most well-known for those of you in the media is our National Hurricane Center, which is in Miami, Florida. And I would like to acknowledge that we do have the new director with us today, Dr. Mike Brennan. So the folks at the Hurricane Center, Mike and his dedicated team of hurricane specialists and marine forecasters have been busy helping communities prepare for the upcoming season, and they will provide the trusted hurricane forecasts that people rely on during the hurricane season this year, which runs, of course, from June 1st to November 30th. Today's news conference is about 15 minutes of remarks by our distinguished speakers, followed by a question and answer session with you, the reporters. We'll first take questions in the room before we move to those participating virtually through our webinar. So today's speakers are U.S. Department of Commerce Deputy Secretary Don Graves, NOAA Administrator Dr. Rick Spinrad, and FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell. Now, it's my true honor to introduce our first speaker, actually, who's going to give the introduction to the first speaker, my colleague, Dr. Rick Spinrad, who I've had the pleasure of working with many years ago when he was the chief scientist for NOAA. Dr. Spinrad's held many other leadership positions within NOAA, including leading our nation, the National Ocean Service, as well as NOAA research. And put all together, that gives him really the depth and breadth that's really unparalleled in history of NOAA administrators. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Spinrad. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. And it is my pleasure to welcome Deputy Secretary Don Graves here today. Deputy Secretary Graves has been a very strong supporter of both NOAA's mission and our workforce, and in fact has really been an integral champion within the Department of Commerce to make sure that the work we're doing at NOAA is closely coordinated with all of the equities and entities within the department, especially in the context of our work towards developing a climate-ready nation to ensure that the public and communities and industry have the kind of reliable, actionable, and accessible information needed to make decisions related to weather and climate events. And with that, we're very glad to have Deputy Secretary Graves here today, and I will turn the mic over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Spinrad, and thank you all for having me here today. Welcome to everyone who's participating in this press conference. Welcome to NOAA's National Center for Weather and Climate Prediction. At the Commerce Department, we're fully committed to NOAA's mission to study, forecast, and issue watches, warnings, and other decision support for tropical systems in our ocean basins. Here and in offices across the country, tireless work is being undertaken to forecast major storm systems, from the pilots who fly our hurricane hunters that collect the weather data that scientists use that track the patterns of severe weather events, to the scientists who use that data to make better predictions. It's no mistake that NOAA and the National Weather Service find their home in the Commerce Department. Hurricanes and the destruction they cause can have devastating impacts to affected communities and to local economies. We know that recent hurricane seasons have been particularly busy, with 3 back-to-back La Nina events, which only increased the threat of hurricanes. Last year alone, we saw 14 named storms accumulate, 3 of them hurricanes that hit the United States, causing a collective $117 billion in damages when adjusted for inflation. The World Meteorological Organization retired the storm names of Fiona and Ian, and those destructive storms made landfall in Puerto Rico and Southwest Florida, respectively, and caused billions of dollars of damage. The increasing impacts and risks to U.S. communities from these destructive storms make the work of NOAA and its partners in government, the private sector, and NGOs all the more essential. It's critical that this work goes a long way to better prepare the United States for storms and effectively addresses environmental, economic, and humanitarian impacts to help communities recover from these events. To broaden the impact of NOAA's work, we have to make continuous investments focused on innovation aimed at supporting NOAA's ability to make accurate weather forecasts through implementing more powerful supercomputers, developing upgraded forecast models, extending NOAA's decision support services to local officials who are responsible for public safety, employing better satellite observations, including state-of-the-art GOES and polar orbiting satellites, and expanding community outreach to equip every community in the country with the information that they need to appropriately prepare and respond to potential hurricanes. These investments are critical because preparedness protects property, informs communities, and saves lives. NOAA's investments from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, $6 billion in total, represent transformative opportunities to support all Americans, including vulnerable populations, in efforts to make our communities even more resilient to future weather and climate events. Just last month, the Department of Commerce and NOAA announced $562 million in recommended funding for projects across the country to help make coastal communities more resilient to climate impacts through the Climate Ready Coasts Initiative. These investments are a key part of NOAA's efforts to build a climate-ready nation, where our country's prosperity, health, and safety benefit from understanding climate change and taking action at all levels to reduce climate impacts. As we continue to make advances in understanding and forecasting hurricanes and extreme weather, our scientists strive to learn from every storm and apply that knowledge to future storm analysis. As a result, NOAA's hurricane predictions are more accurate than they've ever been, based on advancements with our new hurricane model. Reanalysis of forecasts for storms from 2020 to 2022 has shown that today, the accuracy of our forecast track has improved by 40% since 2017, and the accuracy of our forecast intensity has improved by 46%. Since 2017, we've also improved the lead time for hurricane forecasts by 2 days, and the 7-day track forecast now has the same accuracy as the 5-day track forecast. The lead time of our storm surge forecast has also grown. Our 3-day advanced storm surge forecast today has the same accuracy as the previous 2-day forecast. These additional days of preparedness can make all the difference in places like Florida, Puerto Rico, and other parts of the country in mitigating the destruction and saving countless lives. These improvements not only make our country safer and more informed about hurricanes and their impact, but they also speak to the importance of the work being accomplished each and every day by the dedicated individuals at NOAA. As hurricane season approaches, the overarching message today is clear. NOAA and FEMA are prepared for the upcoming season. Now it's time for communities to prepare as well. It's absolutely crucial that all Americans living in the potential paths of these storms, even well inland of the coast, follow NOAA's guidance for preparation and determine your risk, develop an evacuation plan, and assemble the disaster supplies that you may need if a severe storm strikes. Please stay informed and be ready to heed warnings from NOAA's National Weather Service and your local emergency managers. NOAA, the Department of Commerce, along with our federal partners like FEMA, stand ready to serve the nation before, during, and after each storm, and ensure that communities have the resources they need to overcome the threat that hurricanes pose. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to NOAA and FEMA for their continued service to make this country a safer place. I'm sorry I won't be able to stay for the rest of today's event, but with that, I am pleased to turn it back over to Dr. Spinneret. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Graves, and good morning to everyone. So welcome to the NOAA 2023 Atlantic Hurricane Season Outlook. Let me start by saying that whether you're joining us in person or remotely, we really appreciate your attention to this very important announcement. I want to extend my gratitude to my friend, Dr. Mike Farah, for hosting us, along with the many scientists, technologists, technicians who work around the clock in this building and elsewhere to provide weather, water, and climate forecasts and projections to keep the nation safe and informed. I want to take a moment to recognize also that although we're here today to announce NOAA's 2023 Hurricane Outlook, I do want to acknowledge the people of Guam, CNMI, Rota, Tinian, Saipan, as they respond to begin to recover from the devastating impacts of Typhoon Mawar. I'd also like to thank the NOAA employees working at the National Weather Service's forecast office in Guam, who sheltered in place to ensure continuity of forecast operations throughout the storm. I will say personally, that to me is kind of the sort of extraordinary activity of our workforce, where they're putting mission first, and in many cases when their own lives and livelihoods and families are being threatened. So I can't overstate how much I, as administrator, appreciate the effort they've undertaken. And as officials begin to assess the damage, one thing is clear: the forecasts, warnings, and decision support services that NOAA provided saved many lives. That's unequivocal. So as we enter the start of hurricane season, NOAA and the National Weather Service stand ready to provide our nation with the best possible information. You just heard from the Deputy Secretary that best keeps getting better over time. From our researchers to our satellite operators, our hurricane hunter pilots and specialists and scientists, forecasters and communicators, we are prepared to help communities through the upcoming hurricane season with reliable forecasts, warnings, and decision support services. The question is, are you ready? Each year, we host this news conference at a different hurricane-prone location to highlight the different hazards that a hurricane can bring. Since we're in Maryland today, I'll note that this year marks the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Isabel. Some of us, myself included, were personally affected by that, so we can certainly relate. Many of you who live here in the Mid-Atlantic might recall Hurricane Isabel, which made landfall as a Cat 2 storm in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and whose storm surge wiped out a portion of Hatteras Island. Isabel also brought record storm surge up the Chesapeake Bay, resulting in significant flooding in Baltimore and Annapolis. Power outages, including at my own home, were a significant effect of the storm, and Isabel is directly responsible for 17 deaths, mainly through drowning, 34 indirect deaths. Several of those were attributed to carbon monoxide poisoning from generators running in closed spaces without proper ventilation. Carbon monoxide poisoning, in fact, is one of the leading causes of death after storms in areas dealing with power outages. Never use a portable generator inside your home or garage. This year also marks the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Florence, which experienced rapid intensification off the East Coast and brought significant flooding to the Carolinas. Riverine flooding, not wind, was the major cause of damage and loss of life in Florence. Damages from Florence are estimated to be $24.2 billion. Recovery efforts from the extensive flooding continued for 8 weeks. These recovery efforts were prolonged by impacts from Hurricane Michael, a destructive Category 5 storm, as it moved inland. Michael dumped heavy rain and brought hurricane-force winds across a huge swath of the eastern U.S. from Florida through the mid-Atlantic. Many of us remember where we were when these storms hit and how they impacted our communities. Marking their anniversaries helps us remember that being prepared means staying prepared. Another important facet of reviewing previous storms is that we can see the progression of improvements in our observations and forecasting systems that grew out of experience and knowledge each storm provided, whether it be by rapid intensification, intense rainfall, storm surge, or other features. NOAA is in a constant posture of upgrading and improving our service to this nation. Let me give you some examples of key enhancements we're making this year to boost our capabilities for the upcoming hurricane season. As you just heard from Deputy Secretary Graves, investments under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act have afforded NOAA the opportunity to better support coastal communities responding to climate change through NOAA's Climate Ready Coasts initiative. We have two new forecast model enhancements this year. A major upgrade to our storm surge model expands probabilistic forecasts for storm surge to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, now providing emergency managers and coastal communities with the most likely range of storm surge values so they can be better prepared and informed. Next month, we're launching a new hurricane model that will eventually become our primary hurricane model. The model, called the Hurricane Analysis and Forecast System, was developed by NOAA researchers with hurricane disaster supplemental funding in 2018, 2019, and 2022. Retrospective analysis of storms in the North Atlantic Basin from 2020 to 2022 showed that the new hurricane model provides up to a 15% improvement in track and intensity forecasts over existing models. Directed by the Weather Act of 2017 and developed under NOAA's Hurricane Forecast Improvement Program, the new model aims to improve forecasts for rapid intensification. All of our forecast models run on NOAA's operational supercomputing system. In July, we'll be expanding our supercomputing capacity by 20%. This upgrade will allow us to run more complex forecast models and provide faster and more efficient computing power for operational prediction, research, and development. Once implemented, the system will be able to perform 29 quadrillion calculations per second. The expansion will provide the supercomputing power that's necessary to support forecast model upgrades for years to come. Additional notable product and services upgrades include this year, the National Hurricane Center extended their tropical weather outlooks from 5 days to 7 days. Being able to forecast further out in time helps emergency managers better prepare for the storm. Also, the Weather Prediction Center's excessive rainfall outlook will be operationally expanded out to day 5 this season. Flooding is the deadliest tropical cyclone hazard in the U.S., and these outlooks now provide up to 5 days of lead time on the threat of flash flooding from intense rainfall. This year, we're also continuing to improve our use of various observing tools to better sense the atmosphere within a storm, as well as the ocean state surrounding the system. This includes unmanned drones, sounding balloons, as well as additional sail drones and underwater gliders. Thanks to bipartisan infrastructure law funding, NOAA's National Data Buoy Center will modernize and upgrade the Tropical Atmosphere Ocean (TAO) buoy array. Data from these buoys are fundamental to understanding our knowledge of El Nino and La Nina, as you just heard the DepSec allude to, and our ability to better simulate and predict them in climate models. The El Nino and La Nina climate patterns can influence Atlantic hurricane season. These are exciting investments and advancement that will help our agency support communities living in the path of tropical cyclones. This funding and these new capabilities will go a long way in helping us build a climate-ready nation that's more resilient to the threats posed by climate change. So, without further ado, let's dive into this year's Atlantic hurricane season outlook. NOAA is predicting a near-normal 2023 Atlantic hurricane season. Specifically, there is a 40% chance of a near-normal season, a 30% chance of an above normal season, and a 30% chance of a below normal season. For the range of storms expected, NOAA calls for the following: 12 to 17 named storms with top winds of at least 39 miles per hour. Of these, 5 to 9 are forecast to become hurricanes with maximum winds of at least 74 miles per hour. This includes 1 to 4 major hurricanes ranking as Category 3 or above and winds of at least 111 miles per hour. Before I close, I'd like to take a moment to remind you now that it's time to prepare. Remember, it only takes one storm to devastate a community. Regardless of the statistics I shared, if one of those named storms is hitting your home, your community, it's very serious. I'd also like to give special thanks to the skilled and dedicated forecasters at the National Hurricane Center in Miami, who work around the clock to deliver timely and accurate forecasts each and every hurricane season, as well as the hurricane hunters who fly hundreds of hours each hurricane season to support critical hurricane forecasting and research, and the numerous members of the emergency management community who are so critical to protecting lives and property. And the experts at the Climate Prediction Center, who develop seasonal outlooks, including the hurricane seasonal outlook, which are used as a tool by decision makers, emergency managers, and the public when preparing for the season ahead. And finally, the dedicated forecasters of the National Weather Service, who work around the clock in every U.S. community to provide weather forecasts and warnings the entire nation can depend on. The dedication of these public servants quite literally saves lives and safeguards our communities and businesses. And now it's my pleasure to invite FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Administrator Spinrad, for that incredible briefing on what we're going to be seeing this year and just for your continued partnership, right? I think as we have heard all of the advances that the Prediction Center has made and how we can better improve our forecasting, it makes such an incredible difference to the emergency management community and how we can make sure that we're getting the right information to people in a timely manner so they can take the appropriate actions to protect themselves and their families. We simply just cannot do our jobs without the support of NOAA, the National Hurricane Center, as well as the National Centers for Environmental Protection. But I'd also like to take a minute to thank all of the journalists and the media in the room, because you help us amplify that message. Everybody gets their information in different ways, and your ability to help get out to all communities really makes a difference in making sure we're getting that critical information in a timely manner. I think as we've heard today, the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season is quickly going to be upon us, but we are already in the Pacific hurricane season right now. And as we are seeing the impacts of Super Typhoon Mawar, what we are seeing is that these types of events are increasing and intensifying more rapidly, which is what we saw over the last few days. But it also reminds us, and I think as we've heard today already, that regardless of the number of named storms that are out there, regardless of the time of year, whether we're in the peak of hurricane season or not, it just takes one, and it can happen with the very first storm, which is what we're seeing right now. Very first storm of the Pacific hurricane season causing significant damage. So that means that we do need to prepare today, and so grateful to have this opportunity to get this message out there. FEMA is ready, but we are just one part of the team to make sure that we are increasing the preparedness across the nation. It takes our partners like NOAA and the Department of Commerce, as well as the entire federal family, to make sure that we are ready to meet this challenge. And I can tell you that we are ready to meet this challenge. We take the time to reflect, right? We took the time to reflect on the lessons that we have learned from last year and previous years and carry those forward into this hurricane season. We also want to look at the efforts that we've made and the impacts and the advances that they've made to helping our communities. And so I just want to give you a few examples of some of the things that we have done to make sure that we can help communities before, during, and after disasters better every year. One of the areas that I have been very focused on is our ability to try to meet people where they are. instead of having individuals and having communities try to navigate the federal government. How do we bring those services to the people? And recognizing that every community and every individual has a unique experience, has unique needs, and their impacts will be specific to them. And so we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to how we prepare, how we respond, and most importantly, how we recover from these disasters. And so we did a few things over the last year to make sure that we are living up to meeting people where they are. We changed our policies to make sure that those who need our help the most have the ability to access that help, and that we're removing barriers so those that are eligible for assistance can actually access that assistance. One of these things was a policy change to the types of documentation that we accept to prove that you own your home or that you occupy your home. And because of this update, I'm very proud about the number of individuals that have been able to get assistance. Since we made this change, over 128,000 individuals and families have been eligible for assistance, bringing over $754 million into their pocketbooks to help them jumpstart their recovery. These are individuals we would have denied assistance in the past because of our policies, but because of these simple policy changes have really made a difference in the ability for these individuals to start their recovery process. We're also leveraging technology in ways to help us improve our response efforts. A couple of examples of things that we've done here. During Hurricane Ian last year, we used the first multi-agency deployment of geospatial resources to the field to really help us pinpoint those communities that had the most impact, to help direct all of our resources in a way that was more timely. Really helped us use the intelligence in a way that we were able to operationalize it and make life-saving decisions. We also continue our work to help communities build resilience to disasters. We're seeing more and more impacts from these hurricanes, and so we have to get ahead of that, and we have to make communities more resilient and reduce the impacts that we're seeing. Just last week, we announced over $160 million in climate resilience funding. This is additional funding as part of our mitigation programs in the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities and our flood mitigation assistance programs to really help these communities get ahead of the impacts and start to build resilience. We also selected an additional 46 communities for direct technical assistance, helping these communities, bringing the federal family together to come into these communities and help them think about the ways that they can build resilience, the way that they can reduce impact and be more eligible for the different grant programs that are available across the federal government. And today, I'm also happy to share that our partners at HHS announced $65 million in funding for healthcare centers in areas that were hit hard from hurricanes last year. This funding is going to help prevent flooding, upgrade emergency generators, and improve communication and mechanical systems ahead of future disasters. This is yet another example of the Biden-Harris administration's whole of government approach to making sure that our communities are more prepared to withstand the impacts of these extreme weather events. And as I said, we are just one part of the team. FEMA is not in this fight alone. And one of my main focus areas is making sure that those that may have been impacted or may be impacted by a hurricane are also ready. Because our best defense against disasters is our local community. Our neighbors helping neighbors, they are our true first responders. And so as we heard, the time to prepare is today. The time to prepare is now. And so there's three things that I think everybody should do today. First, know what your risk is. Hurricanes, they are more than just the cone that we see. They are storm surge. They are significant rainfall. They are carbon monoxide poisoning after. There are so many other hazards. And so you need to know what your risk is, where you live, so you can take the appropriate measures to protect your family. Second, know how you're going to get information. Again, thank you to the media for helping us do that. We all get information in very different ways. There are a number of resources that are available. We always encourage everybody to download the FEMA app. You can also download weather apps from NOAA and the National Weather Service. also in your local community, and sign up for their emergency alerts so you know how you can get information so you can take immediate action when needed. And then third, make an emergency plan. Do you know where your evacuation zone is? Do you know which evacuation zone you're in? Do you know where you're going to go if you're asked to evacuate? Remember that if you are asked to evacuate, moving away from the hazards does not necessarily mean that you have to go another state or two away. It could be just 5 miles away from the hazard into an evacuation center until the threat has passed. So take the time today to learn which evacuation zone you're in and what actions you will take if you are asked to evacuate. And as part of your planning process, it's also time to review all of your important documents. Make sure you have them prepared and ready to go with you in case you need to use them. Review your insurance policies and consider flood insurance if you don't have it already. At FEMA, we say that no two disasters are the same. And in that same spirit, being prepared means that it is not a one-size-fits-all solution. You need to understand what your risk is, what your family needs are, what your unique circumstances are, to take those appropriate measures to protect you and your family. So I implore everybody that is watching at home, listening to this in their car, or reading this in your local newspaper or social media event, learn today what your individual risk is and the actions that you're going to take and plan accordingly. These storms are going to continue to develop faster. They are going to be stronger. They will last longer. FEMA will be ready to support you. If one hits you, are you going to be ready? So with that, I'll turn it back to Dr. Farrar.
Thank you so much, Administrator Criswell. Before we move on to the Q&A portion, I'd like to I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. Yeah, it is correct. I'm sorry. Before we move on to the Q&A portion, I'd like to introduce Matt Rosenkrantz, who is our lead hurricane season outlook forecaster with NOAA's Climate Prediction Center. Matt will be available to answer questions about the science behind today's hurricane outlook. So we'll begin with questions from reporters in the room. Please raise your hand, and Allison from NOAA Communications will bring the microphone to you. For those of you joining us by webinar, you may also ask a question using the raise hand feature. Until such time as you're called upon, please, everyone online, please keep your phones on mute. When we do call on you, then unmute your microphone, state your name and media affiliation before asking your question, and the same for the reporters in the room as well. If you prefer to submit a written question, you may also do so using the question box on the right of your screen, and we'll read your answer aloud in the room. Also, if possible, if you have something to be directed to a specific person of our speakers, please let us know who you're directing your question to. And we'll do our best to answer questions in the time available. So for now, we'll take the first reporter question in the room.
Seth Borenstein, AP. For Matt, in terms of the forecast, I assume, like others, you're dealing with the clash between El Nino dampening and the very hot Atlantic increasing. Can you explain a little the dynamics there in your forecast? And more importantly, El Nino, once it happens, you know it's going to be around for a few months. How confident are you that the hot Atlantic, the record hot Atlantic that we're seeing now, will be there for a few months? And can you give some insight onto why it is so warm?
So, yeah, those two things did come into the forecast. The interplay between the El Nino and the favorable conditions across the Atlantic, not just the sea surface temperatures, but as well as the wind patterns and the shear patterns that are over the Atlantic, as well as the predicted shear patterns over the Atlantic. So it's kind of like a clash between those two big features. El Nino can control about 33 to 38% of the variance, so it's not all of it. The sea surface temperature in the Atlantic should stay around for months through the summertime, once they're established. Overall, the patterns in the Atlantic that are favorable, they change in what we call the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. They change every 25 to 40 years. Now, the specifics as far as how warm it is this year, we are warmer than we were last year. We're about as warm as we were in 2020. Once you move into the summer season and you establish kind of strong high pressures over the Atlantic Ocean, over most of the ocean basins, it's very hard you're not going to disrupt that tropical temperatures as much. You can disrupt the mid-latitude with storms, but not as much the tropics. So once it's kind of established, it's likely to hold on just as long as ENSO is likely to hold on through the entire season. Now, El Nino, right now the forecast is a 93% chance for that to be an El Nino phase during the core of the Atlantic hurricane season, August, September, and October. But that is, again, that is likely to last many, many months.
Hi there. Either for Matthew or Dr. Spinrad, or actually, I guess any of the three could address this. Chase Kane with NBC, wondering about the sort of abnormally warm ocean temperatures, the impact that can have on rapid intensification. People on the coastline might see, oh, a Category 1, I don't need to evacuate, and then all of a sudden it's Cat 3, 4, 5 storm. How do you communicate that risk as these temperatures get warmer and these storms intensify more quickly?
No, I'll start and then ask if anybody like to do it. I mean, we certainly have been communicating this risk through our forecasters at the Hurricane Center. Our hurricane models have also been able to improve the rapid intensification forecasting over the last several years. So we've been able to communicate that earlier than has been possible in the past. If there's anybody, would you like to add anything else?
I want to make sure Administrator Criswell talks about their response, but I want to add a little bit geekier perspective on the intensification, because I think I may be the only card-carrying oceanographer in the room. And I will point out that one of the important things that we're doing at NOAA is looking obviously at sea surface temperature, but also it's about total heat content. And so making use of a lot of satellite capabilities and then the new observational capabilities that we alluded to, like gliders, for example, allows us to get better information about how much total energy is in the ocean available to contribute to intensification. So that's part of the improvement that you've seen that then gets reflected in the kind of forecast that Mike just alluded to.
It's a great question. And I think one of the things that we have to focus on as we go into this hurricane season is not just the hazard itself, right? Not just the category of the storm, but all of the risks that go with it. And so is it going to intensify more rapidly? What are the other pieces that we're concerned about? You know, the new accuracy or the modeling that we're going to be able to do for storm surge. This part of risk communication is where I think that we need to direct our focus to, and using all of the mediums that we have available. And it's going to be even more important that we start to get those types of messages out sooner across all forms of social media, national and local news, but using the emergency alert apps that people have to be able to get that information, to be able to take action quickly. But you can only take action quickly if you take the steps today to make sure that you're ready to take that action quickly. And so being able to communicate those risks and what those risks are and not just the category is going to be a cultural shift, right? And a mind shift for the people that live in areas that are typically going to say, well, I've lived through a Category 1 and then all of a sudden it's a Category 3, or I've lived through this before, and now we have intense storm surge and we have increased rainfall that's creating additional hazards that they haven't experienced before. The risks of these storms are different than the risks that they faced 10 years ago. We have to be able to get that message out to people.
Hi, I'm Tom Frank from E&E News. I have a question for you, Administrator Criswell, about FEMA preparation. First, the disaster relief fund, you said it's going to run out of money in August and that you're going to ask for more money. I want to ask, have you put the request in? What's the status? And then also FEMA staffing. The GAO just put out a report talking about shortfalls in staffing. What are you doing about that?
So on the disaster relief fund, yes, we're still projecting a shortfall. I believe it's in August now. It's been pushed back. And we are still working with the administration on what a supplemental request would look like. I can tell you that we will always have enough money to be able to respond and make sure that we can support any life-saving efforts that need to happen. But if we do end up with a shortfall, we would see some impacts to the ability to continue ongoing recovery operations. But we continue to work with the administration on that. And as far as staffing in the GAO report, you know, our staffing models in the past have been based on a peak hurricane season type of planning assumption, but we're seeing the threats and the hazards that we're facing that affect us year round, January 1 through December 31st. We're seeing an increased and a sustained operational tempo. And so we are taking, you know, steps to relook at what our planning assumptions are, throw on top of that a global pandemic, supporting other emergency events around the areas that don't necessarily get to Stafford Act declarations like the Ohio train derailment, and we have to relook at what that is. But the GAO report also just focuses on our disaster response force. We also have all of our staff that are at headquarters that we can reassign as needed to support our disaster response. We have our surge capacity where we can tap into all of our DHS partners and other federal partners to come in and support different areas. And we did just get great legislation passed by Congress that gives us USERRA protection that's going to really change our ability to recruit the biggest part and the most critical part of our workforce, which is our reservists. And so they now get job protection. And so now we have the ability to recruit very specifically some subject matter experts, but also broaden the pool of individuals that want to be able to support response operations like this, but have a day job. Now they'll have that job protection to be able to go in and support some of our efforts as needed. And so we're using that as a targeted recruiting tool going forward.
Good morning. Tom Pershut, Chief Med WSA 9 here in Washington. I love computer models, so I'm intrigued with this new hurricane model. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution? Did you start from scratch? Did you take some models and blend them? And when can I get my hands on it? Matt or Rick, I don't know who wants to take that.
I can start.
Okay, please.
So the new hurricane analysis and forecast system is actually being built on the framework of our unified forecast system. This is where we're taking a unified framework for our global and regional models. And so it's been built inside that framework. So we did not start from scratch, but we've added new physics, improved data assimilation and dynamics. And as Dr. Spinner talked about, right out of the box, the very first time we're going to implement it, at least for the 3 years we ran it in retrospective, we were getting around 15% improvement on track and intensity forecasting that we used to have on our HWRF and HMON limited area of hurricane models. Those aren't the only models. We still make use of the global models like the GFS, our international models like the European model as well, and statistical models. So all those are thrown into the mix, and you add on top of that the expertise of our forecasters at the Hurricane Center. So we're continuing to incrementally improve the quality of our modeling. Oh, it's going to be implemented about a month from now, in late June. Okay, I think we've got our first question online.
Yes, we have a question online. We have a hand raised from Lance Blocker. Lance, I am unmuting you now. You have to unmute yourself. Please remember to state your media affiliation before you ask your question. You're good to go, Lance.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Lance Blocker here, 17 News in Raleigh. Hey, we've had a lot of talk about the impressive El Nino and the above average sea surface temperatures. How did you guys simulate this upcoming season to reach the forecast with somewhat of a rare, unique combination with the upcoming months? And did you use any emergent technologies like machine learning or AI with that process?
So we do have we use the global models, again, from our own center and from our partners around the world, UK Met, European Center, that inherently takes into account the sea surface temperatures in the globe all at once. We do have work with the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory that has a specific model that addresses interbasin Pacific versus Atlantic sea surface temperatures. That was injected into the forecast. And then we have a few other statistical models. So those are all put into the forecast. The team met, we discussed them, the weak points, the strong points of each one of the models. And then our consensus forecast was the forecast we came up with. And what was the second part of your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was any new technology applied to it, machine learning, AI, any of that, or is it still in experimental phase?
For this product, that is machine learning AI is still in a developmental phase for this product.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We now have a question from Rebecca Hersher. Rebecca, I am unmuting you. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Rebecca Hersher from NPR. I'm wondering if it's abnormal to have this many storms forecast, a 70% chance of a normal or above normal during the year with El Nino? Has that happened before? It seems like a pretty large number.
Yeah, so when I look back on the historical data we've had anywhere from 6 named storms to 18 named storms during El Ninos. The stronger an El Nino event, usually the less amount of storms you have. But we are also in an active era, and having a strong El Nino with an active era and such warm SSTs, I've only seen it one other time in the historical record. There's not a lot of analog evidence for it. So it's definitely kind of a rare setup for this year. And that's why our probabilities are not 60 or 70%. They are a little bit to reflect that uncertainty that all of our, combined a couple hundred years of experience doing tropical analysis with the team. When we looked at it, we were like, wow, there's a lot of uncertainty this year in the outlook. So that's why we have those probabilities and the ranges the way they are.
All right, thank you, Kara. Next, we'll have a question from Kara Corte, CBS News. Kara, I'm unmuting you now. If you can unmute yourself as well.
Thank you all for doing this. Administrator Criswell touched on this a bit, but can you all speak to how you anticipate increased intensity of these storms due to climate change this year and beyond? And then also, I believe there were storms fairly late in the season last year. Is that a trend we can expect again this year and in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, no. This is Rick Spinrad, the other administrator. And I will point out that what we do see with respect to your question on a climate signal, I would say that first of all, fundamentally, we know that with climate change and increased energy coming into the system, that energy has to go somewhere. So we see it in a variety of different forms. You may see it in slightly more energetic forms. You may see it in storms, rather. You may see it in storms that, for example, yield more precipitation, slightly stronger winds, that kind of thing. And so I oftentimes use the case of Hurricane Harvey, where we saw almost 5 feet of rainfall as an example of the kinds of manifestations that increased energy coming into the system can produce. And you had a second question, which I think might be more appropriate for Matt with respect to some of the statistics. Can you repeat that question, please?
Yes, I believe there were storms fairly late in the season last year, later than normal into November. And so I'm wondering if we anticipate that happening again.
So this specific outlook does not have any information about early or late season storms within today's outlook. We have during active years, like 2020, 2021, we do tend to see more early season and late season activity, but that's generally because the entire situation is more conducive to more formations. So if you have an active year, you typically do have more front and back end to the season storms. But not necessarily. But this specific outlook does not have any information, and it's not part of the package that we look at. We're just doing the total season from these numbers. So we're not. I can't really give you any information on should we expect a late season this year or not.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Scott Dance. Scott, I am unmuting you. If you can unmute yourself as well.
Yeah, thank you. This is Scott Dance with the Washington Post. I was just wondering, is this forecast maybe a sign that global warming and ocean warming in particular could change the way that El Nino behaves in the Atlantic basin in hurricane season, or the effect of it, limit the effect of it in some way?
So there's kind of 2 parts to that answer. There is open areas of research within NOAA and the academic community on the global response to El Nino or La Nina, and what does that look like in future scenarios with a warming planet. And then as far as, so that's an open area of research that still needs to be investigated. And then as far as this year, El Nino versus the sea surface temperature, as I said, it's a pretty rare condition to have both of these going on at the same time. Favorable conditions in the Atlantic, the El Nino developing, So there's not really a lot of analogs for that to look at.
And our last audio question will be from Emily Foxhall. Emily, I'm gonna unmute you if you can unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm in Houston and I write for the Texas Tribune. I was wondering, Matt, if you guys looked at this regionally at all and if there's anything in the Gulf that might make things better or worse for us here.
No, this particular forecast is or outlook is for the entire basin. There was really no skill or attempted regional outlook for it. So there's no additional information on where in the Atlantic basin it will be or whether or not it will be making landfall or not. It's just the total number of storms through the season.
Claire Fiesler with the Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina. Can perhaps Administrator Criswell can talk about this. Can you talk about recovery efforts in situations of high frequency storms making landfall within 2 weeks of each other in the same place? This is something that we've dealt with in South Carolina.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? And so anytime we have a community that is ongoing or still going through a recovery from a previous storm, it just makes them that much more vulnerable to any future events that might come through there. And so we pay very close attention to what the current status of recovery efforts are and where the gaps are, where the weakened infrastructure is and where it's more vulnerable, so we can put the appropriate measures in place to have the resources available to quickly stabilize that event afterwards, but also if there's anything that we can do to shore up or stabilize ahead of a storm. I think a good example of that is really some work that we're doing in Puerto Rico right now. After Hurricane Fiona, we used our ability to go in and provide some stabilization to the power grid to help make them more resilient for this coming hurricane season, an effort that's a temporary measure to increase the number of megawatts that they're able to produce to help make sure that they can withstand. That's just one example, and those are the types of things that we work with governors and my state directors with if they are going to experience a storm and understanding what their impacts are and where their recovery efforts are, but really listening to them where their greatest concerns are and where their greatest needs will be. But it's also really important then for individuals, right, that are still ongoing their recovery efforts to be able to take those actions today to know what they're going to do, how they're going to prepare, where they're going to go to be able to protect themselves and their families.
We're now going to go to a couple of written questions from contributors online.
Yes, thank you. Our first written question is from Judson Jones with the New York Times. Judson wants to know, with above average sea surface temperatures and current weather patterns, is there a concern for early season storms forming near the U.S.?
So there is no information in this outlook that would talk about front-loaded early season storms or late season. I do know that I looked at the Hurricane Center website this morning and they do have a small area of potential in the next 7 days just off the Carolina coast, but it's only a 10% chance. That's the current Hurricane Center. And you stick with the Hurricane Center, watching them day to day, hour by hour. The forecasters are always there updating their tropical weather outlooks. So that's probably your best source of information for day-to-day information.
Thank you, Matthew. We have a question from Holly Parker with WNO. Given the issues of rapid intensification and warmer waters, has that affected how many major hurricanes you forecast for the season in proportion to the total number of hurricanes at all?
The rapid intensification, the changes in that current years did not play an actual computational impact into the numbers. The numbers come out of the models and the statistical models, they all come out at the same time. There is a relatively smaller percentage, with 1 to 4 major hurricanes as a percentage of the number of named storms that could make major hurricane. And that's really a reflection of the potential for increased shear and decreased or an increased stability due to the impacts of El Nino. We tend to see more of an impact on the major hurricanes rather than the number of named storms when we look at the statistics between past El Nino events and then obviously this current forecast El Nino event.
Thank you. We have one more question, chat question from Matt Brickman from NBC New York. Understanding that having these two conflicting factors is unusual, can you speak to the reasons for the warmer than usual Atlantic sea surface temperatures this season during an El Nino year?
No, I don't have the knowledge of the attribution of why the sea surface temperatures in the specific spots in the Atlantic stayed warm this year. I mean, I understand the general physics behind it, but the specifics for this year would be more of a bit of an attribution study that could be done either by the researchers or even some of my colleagues.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question in the room. Allison, would you?
Seth Borenstein, AP, maybe for you or Dr. Spenrad or Mike Brennan, since he's somewhere in the room. Back to the new hurricane forecast model. In terms of rapid intensification, you're saying it's an improvement of about 15%. How do you, first off, do you think this is the solution to the long problem you've had with rapid intensification and being caught unaware? And second is this the first time you're taking ocean heat content into factoring it in the modeling, or are you giving it higher credence than you have in the past? So I'm wondering how big a factor is ocean heat content in the improvement here?
So we have always used sea surface temperature and ocean content as a boundary condition for our models. So that part is nothing new. Certainly better modeling, better physics, everything else, and better use of data has led to incremental improvements in our intensity forecasts. So, I mean, there's no silver bullet here. We need continued observations, continued improvement in the models, potentially higher resolution and more ensemble members to get it to the uncertainty. So I think we're just going to continue to crack away at this problem, just like we do in the atmospheric forecast, just continue for incremental improvements. Did you have anything to add?
Mike, you might just want to add that part of the ocean that is different is our observational capabilities. So whether it's through gliders or something, autonomous systems.
Dr. Spinner made a good point. Part of our gaps in the past has been really we have a lot of satellite data, a lot of data over the surface of the land surface, but our in situ ocean observations are pretty sparse. And so we made use not of just with the conventional buoys, but we've been taking advantage into new commercial platforms and mobile platforms such as the gliders, and the sail drones, for example. And adding those observations in has really helped us incrementally. Is that gonna be the last word? We got one more. I think we have time for one more. Go ahead.
Chase Kane with NBC. For Administrator Criswell, I'm wondering if you could talk about with the overall trend of whether it's hurricanes or other climate-fueled weather events costing a lot more money, causing more damage. How do we shift the conversation to adaptation instead of just the disaster response?
Incredibly important question. We are definitely seeing an increase in the amount of recovery costs that we are doing. I don't have the exact stat in front of me, but it's somewhere of the amount of money that we've spent over the last 5 years in recovery is equivalent to like the previous 15 years, right? And so we can certainly get you that number, but we have to switch that conversation. We have to be able to get ahead of this and get out of this continuous response, recover, rinse, and repeat cycle and get ahead of this and reduce the impacts. That's why we've made incredible investments through the programs that we have, through our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Mitigation Program, our Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. Also, as we're doing recovery, we have the ability to do mitigation as they're rebuilding to make sure that they can rebuild their infrastructure in a way that's going to reduce the impacts from future disasters. That's just FEMA's part in this, but this takes the entire whole of society to be able to have these conversations, to look at what your future risks are going to be and take the measures today to put the adaptation pieces in place to help reduce those impacts. And it has to be based on the future risks. We can't continuously focus our efforts on what has happened to us in the past, because the threats and the risks that we're experiencing today are different than 10 years ago. They're going to be different than what we see 10 years from now. And so through the work of NOAA and all of the different climate products that they're putting out there to help us better understand what those risks are going to be critically important as we make those investment decisions today.
That appears to be our last question. So I'd like to once again thank our speakers for today. Deputy Secretary Graves, who's had to leave before, NOAA Administrator Dr. Spinrad, FEMA Administrator Criswell, and our lead hurricane forecaster Matt Rosenkrantz. A reminder that the news release for today's announcement is available at noaa.gov. A recording of the event will also be added to the news release later this afternoon. Follow-up questions and interview requests may be sent to nws.pa@noaa.gov. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate all your wonderful questions and interaction. And that concludes today's press conferences. And thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for helping, Scott.
Yep. For our viewers online, just a reminder that the Hurricane Outlook is available online. The Hurricane Outlook is available online. You can see the link in our chat, and a recording of this webinar will be available by this afternoon. Thank you.